Greetings, friends. I've been poring over statistics about Africa from the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. This data is available to anyone if they go to the website called the World Factbook from the CIA. I'll post a link to this site in the description of the video. If you ever want to know the basics of any country in the world, then just check out the World Factbook. I wouldn't always trust the CIA, but I don't see why they would be lying when it comes to these particular statistics about Africa. Anyways, for the past 2 days, I've been collecting and analyzing information from every African nation. Yes, every single one, from north to south and west to east. For each country, I gathered stats in the following categories: area, or in other words, the size of the country. How many square kilometers is it? Population, population growth rate, religious composition of the society, and lastly, languages. I won't talk much about languages, but it was helpful to see how dominant the Arabic language was in certain countries. It's not actually dominant everywhere, but it is in certain places. My main question for looking into this data was about how Islam and Christianity stack up to each other within Africa. And I can tell you that I have a much clearer view of the issue now after doing this research. So the question was, does one religion or the other have the upper hand? Like, does it have more followers? Is it growing faster? Is it going to supersede one? This was the main focus of my analysis, and the dynamics between Christianity and Islam in Africa will make up the meat of this video. But I also spent time thinking about population growth in general in Africa, economic development, and the quantity of fertile land in these countries. So I'll be sharing my thoughts with you on these matters too, and I'll do so in the beginning. So let's get into it. What are my reflections on all this data? Well, the population of Africa is growing extremely fast. That would be one of the number one things that just is undeniable in this information. Most countries are currently increasing at between 2 and 3% per year. Can you imagine between 2 and 3% of your current population you're going to add within 1 year? Only a handful of African countries are experiencing less than 1% growth. So this represents a truly enormous phenomenon. Why is Africa's population growing so fast? Well, part of the answer has to do with the gradual implementation of Western medicine since the 19th century, and therefore fewer deaths of infants and deaths of women giving birth, as well as increased agricultural yields. But I do not see how this trend can continue in Africa for the next 20 years with this 3% growth. Some economic, environmental, or political catastrophe will slow this trend down. It must. Or perhaps I could be proven wrong. But there's only a certain amount of space with arable land in Africa. Arable meaning you can cultivate it. The soil is good. It gets rainfall. And as I study the map, and I look at the statistics from the CIA, the map, I mean Google Maps, and I know I'm not much of a techie and I don't have images for my videos yet, but if one thing you could do for this video is you could just go to Google Maps and follow along on preferably satellite, go to satellite as I'm yakking on here, and then you can just follow the countries and it'll illustrate what I'm saying about. You can see where the land is dry, you can see where the land's better. It has to do with how green it is. And that, how green it is and how it looks on Google Maps is not everything, of course. That's not going to tell you, what you can do in this country, what you can grow here. But it's going to tell you a lot. It's going to give you the general idea. And if you look at the Sahara, you see why practically no one lives there. Anyways, so, there's only a certain amount of arable land in Africa. So when I see many parts of Africa and look at these statistics, especially when I look at places in West Africa, and I see places that look like they've nearly filled up their carrying capacity for population. I mean, look at Nigeria. Sure, Nigeria has great land for farming, clearly. But it already has 186 million people. That's the most populous African country, I believe. And as an investor, I'm not looking at Nigeria for that reason. It looks kind of like it's already full, and it has a lot of other problems too, like which I'll get into. So there are, however, some places in Africa that appear to have huge tracts of land, of arable land, or other natural resources, huge tracts of rainforest, for example. And I guess I'm frightening the environmentalists here. But yeah, there is timber resources like you wouldn't believe, but specifically huge tracts of arable land, and which are simply undeveloped. In particular, I'm pointing to Gabon and Central African Republic, or C.A.R. for short. So these two nations stand out for being relatively large countries. I mean, in terms of their area. I mean, Gabon would be a little, significantly bigger than the U.S. state of Kansas. And it has vast timber resources. In fact, it's a unique country, even more than proportionally in terms of its area. Only Brazil could have, or certain other countries could have anything approaching what Gabon has. It's practically an entire forest, the entire country. So that doesn't necessarily mean you can develop agriculture there easily, but it does mean you have timber resources. So it also stands out with C.A.R. For having all of this vast quantities of land, but a very low population. The contrast is really striking. Gabon has only 1.7 million people, yet its area is slightly larger than that of Ghana, which is the same part of the world. Ghana is just around the Gulf of Guinea, on the other side of Nigeria, Benin, Togo. Then you're at Ghana. Okay, similar environment, same general latitude, longitude. I mean, same general degrees north of the equator, but Ghana's population is 26 million. It's fairly full, almost. And it's growing well, too. I think Ghana is a great country. But yeah, the population is already getting near to its carrying capacity, I'd say. Why are there so few people in a country like Gabon? Gabon is slightly bigger than Ghana. There's only one. That's like having a classroom designed for 26 students, which is fairly normal, right? So the classroom is 26 students full. That's Ghana. The other classroom next door, it only has one kid in it. It's unoccupied. It gives you the sense that a lot of development could occur in Gabon. And it's on the ocean too, which is good for export, import, for ties with the rest of the world. I mean, it has ties to colonial France originally. But for whatever reason, like many African countries, all these problems, but that's another story, because these challenges are not unique. Corruption, war, all these things. It's like, yeah, all of these problems are happening and holding these countries back, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're unique challenges and that they somehow one day cannot be overcome. So, yeah, it's with C.A.R., it's a bit bigger. It has 5.5 million people, yet it's really an immense country. It's far bigger than Gabon. I mean, with Gabon, you look at those huge rainforest tracts, and you might think, oh, well, that could act as a barrier to farming. The thing is, rainforests often offer very poor soil. People don't realize that. They think rainforest is going to be good for agriculture. That's not always the case. Sometimes they have terrible soil, like in the Amazon rainforest in South America. It sits mostly on low nutrient soil that only supports slash and burn farming for about 5 years before being depleted, and then you have to move on to different land. But in Central African Republic, and it's really kind of in the center of Africa, it's a landlocked country, fairly big. I mean, it's far bigger than Ghana, like 2, 3, 4 times. I don't know, but it's much bigger. It's about 10 times Togo. You look at a tiny country like Togo, the C.A.R. would fit Togo about 10.8 times. So it's fairly sizable. And those huge tracts of land, they don't seem to have the immense forests that Gabon has. You can clearly see this on the map. However, the land looks really green. It looks really fertile. It seems to be just waiting for someone to develop it. And there's only 5.5 million people in this country. So it seems kind of like it. Here you actually have space to grow, seriously. And of course, I know there have been problems, civil unrest in this country, you know. So who knows? There's always a reason why it hasn't developed. But I'm just saying, look, there's obviously room to grow, whether it will happen or not. So this is why I think, you know, what I've been pointing out here, the space, relatively low population, good land in Gabon and the C.A.A, it seems to be the reason why, to me, there's a lot of potential for economic growth within Africa, at least in those two places. So true, these countries have serious problems and doing business would be challenging. I recall that C.I.A was recently experiencing some civil unrest, and I've read that Gabon is extremely corrupt and people are discouraged from becoming entrepreneurs, but these are hardly unique challenges. So I don't see any reason to be daunted by them if you're an investor. Now, I don't think anyone can deny that those two countries are green with good soil, many timber, also mineral resources. That's what I forgot to mention. There's also huge mineral resources in Gabon. For example, I believe they have gold, iron ore, manganese. They may have diamonds. C.A.A may have diamonds too. Not that you want to get involved with the blood diamond trade and all that nonsense, but there are mineral resources there too. So this could bode well for the economy of these countries in the future. They have plenty of space to grow, plenty of natural resources, relatively low populations. Moving on here, you could look at other green and fertile African nations, particularly in West Africa and Central Africa. Côte d'Ivoire, it has 23.7 million people. Cameroon has 24.3 million. We already know how enormous Nigeria's population is. It's 186 million. And likewise, the tiny countries of Togo and Benin are also densely populated. You know, they have 7.7 and 10.7 million people respectively. That's ridiculous compared to C.A.A and Gabon. I mean, together they only have about 7 million people compared to tens and tens and tens of millions of people living in environmentally similar countries. So that's quite ridiculous. How can such a tiny country like Togo have more people than such an expansive, fertile country like Central African Republic? I mean, like I said, Togo would fit inside C.A.A more than 10 times. So those are the only African countries I noticed which I really think have space for further population growth and development. But I'm sure there's still plenty of room for growth in Zambia and even in Ghana, even in Nigeria, and these countries which seem heavily populated. And for the moment, the population continues to grow. And generally, the economy is growing too in Africa. Christianity. Now, this is the main meat of the video, which I really wanted to get into. So now that I've talked about some of these other geographic features, now I can focus on, you know, the main issue of this video, which is the situation of Christianity and Islam in Africa. So Christianity is neck and neck with Islam in Africa, generally speaking, but it really depends on what region you're looking at, what region you're talking about. There's a lot of disparity between the different regions. So Christians have virtually no presence in the Mediterranean, meaning, you know, like really North Africa on the Mediterranean. And they only have a tiny presence in the countries of the Sahara Desert that are based mainly in the Sahara Desert. Now, Christians are head-to-head with Muslims in West Africa, though this region contains a lot of variation. And I'll explain later on in the video where I define West Africa. I know there's a bigger definition that would include, you know, Western North Africa. I don't include that in my definition of West Africa. So anyways, fortunately for Christianity, the Christians have what appears to me at least, to be a strong, enduring, and dominant presence in Central Africa, East Africa, and especially in South Africa. And by South Africa, I mean all the countries south of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not just, you know, South Africa, where you go to see great white sharks and go on safari and try not to get robbed. So I also think that Christians, on the whole, in Africa, possess the better land. That's just how it seems to me, you know. In other words, the Christians tend to possess more of the land suited for agriculture. And therefore, it would seem to me that they would tend to have larger populations. And I was never able to actually calculate exactly, are there more Christians or Muslims in Africa? It really depends on the region, because North Africa, there has a you know, in the Mediterranean has a fairly sizable population too, like a country like Egypt because of the Nile, and Algeria has its coastal regions where there's a heavy population. So those areas do have high populations, but it would seem that south of that there probably are more Christians than Muslims in Africa, just because the Muslims are more limited to the drier, more arid parts. But surprisingly, they've infiltrated a lot of West Africa, as I'll discuss, and other places, which does bring their numbers up, and even on par with Christianity. So it's kind of still a muddled picture, and it's changing, you know, year by year. So Islam and Christianity are especially neck and neck in West Africa, as I mentioned. And by the way, when I was saying earlier that the Muslims their countries in Africa don't have the good land, that was a generalization. I wasn't trying to say that there aren't some Muslim countries with good land in them, but you know, generally you see this strong disparity. The disparity is fairly striking. So as I was saying about West Africa, it's very neck and neck between Christianity and Islam. You might even say West Africa is more Muslim than Christian, but it really depends on where you draw the boundaries of West Africa. Why do I favor Christianity over Islam? As you may gather, I do. Well, I think overall Christianity has a much more positive effect on culture, specifically on the proliferation of small businesses. So I think Christianity is good for capitalism. I mean, generally we see the Christian countries starting to pull ahead of the Islamic countries in terms of economic development. There is no one accepted explanation for this phenomenon. It may have to do with Christians doing business within their own communities and learning to treat each other more honestly, and also absorbing the ethic of hard work, particularly in Protestantism. But of course, Christian countries don't always pull ahead, and in many cases they've stagnated or they've even gone backward. Look at a heavily Christian country like Zimbabwe. Its economy has been ruined by its own government's mismanagement of the economy. And some Islamic North African countries have done all right economically, or at least those fairly strong oil economies, until recent political meddling caused them to fall into chaos. Still, when we look at the top economic players in Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa, are any of these countries dominated by Islam? No. Well, only perhaps Nigeria. And the Muslims in Nigeria, they do have a powerful foothold, but they're still mostly occupying the north of the country, the arid north. Though I do note that the current Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, is Muslim. So when it comes to the question of Islam in Africa, which countries are predominantly Muslim? Well, the predominantly Muslim countries are those in North Africa and the Sahara Desert, and to a lesser but still significant extent, those in East Africa, and of course, to a large degree in West Africa too, I should mention, neck and neck with Christians. So the most pure Islamic countries, where virtually 99% of the population are Muslim, and Islam is the official religion, are those that border the Mediterranean Sea: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Is it Tunisia or Tunisia? I pronounce it Tunisia. I don't know. Libya and Egypt. Of these, Egypt, Libya, and Algeria stand out because of their immense area, with respectively 1 million, 1.7 million, and 2.3 million square kilometers of area. The collective populations of these North Africa, or population singular, the collective population of these North African Mediterranean Muslim countries is 186.2 million people. So that's a lot of Muslims. That's a lot. That's a huge population. You think about the population of Africa as a whole, it's about 1 billion. So that gives you an idea how much of Africa is these North African Mediterranean Arab, mostly Arab people. Because, yeah, the collective population is composed predominantly of Arabs. I mean, some black sub-Saharan Africans work in these countries, but they don't constitute a very large proportion of the population. So those countries that exist further south in the Sahara Desert are also countries which are predominantly Muslim, but their ethnic groups are more related to black Africans genetically than they are to Arabs. Or they are essentially black Africans who've adopted Islam. It's kind of a muddled area in a cultural sense because Arabs have been crossbreeding with Africans for thousands of years. As you may know, the Arabs had their own slave trade throughout the continent long before any Europeans showed up. And I'm not trying to excuse what the Europeans did. I'm just saying the Arabs were doing it for quite a lot longer. And so, you know, these, it's like I was saying, it's a muddled area, and there was this slave trade, so there was this Arab-Muslim influence for a long time. So this region that I'm discussing now, it includes the countries of the Western Sahara, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. The collective population of these countries is 106.47 million people. So you can add that to the 186.2 I just told you. And you have basically another Muslim bloc. That's another Muslim contingent in Africa. So you have now about 294 million. So, you know, minus maybe 5% of that, 10% of that as Christians. Because not in this more southerly band, not all of them are Muslims, particularly in Chad. There's a Christian presence, but still predominantly Muslim. Now, Sudan stands out among these countries for having a relatively large population, 36.7 million people in Sudan, most of which I theorize is located in the south and the east of the country where land is more fertile and rainfall is more reliable. The fact is that the majority of the area in these Saharan countries is wasteland. It's unsuitable for agriculture. And I'm not really sure about raising animals either. I mean, to some extent you can have animals foraging, but after some point you can't do that either when there's no water and nothing for them to eat. So that, you know, that makes it wasteland essentially, and therefore there's no real prospect of these countries ever doubling their populations or tripling their populations unless some kind of technology gets invented that I have not been able to imagine. So at the same time, their populations, just like other African populations, are still growing at breakneck speed. Now, combining the populations of the two regions I've discussed, like I was already trying to do, you know, the Mediterranean Muslim countries and the Saharan Muslim countries, that gives us a total of 292.67 million people, and the vast majority of these people, clearly over 90%, are Muslims. Now let's shift our attention further south to that region I call West Africa, which extends west to east from Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. Some people would include all of the Western Sahara and Mediterranean region in addition to the sub-Saharan countries from Senegal all the way to Nigeria in their definition of West Africa. But to me, this makes no sense. The southern countries on the Gulf of Guinea are completely cut off from the Sahara and North Africa. Their climate and culture is also drastically different. Anyways, if we examine the list of countries I just mentioned, we find that the population generally increases compared to the Saharan countries, though not when compared to the Mediterranean countries, which have relatively large populations, for the simple reason that West Africa is more fertile than the Saharan countries. We also find that Muslims make up much less of the proportion of the population in West Africa, and in many places they are a minority, though this trend is not uniform. There are several West African countries where Muslims are still the vast majority, such as Senegal, where 95.4% are Muslim, and Guinea, where 86.7% are Muslim. Nigeria stands out in Africa for a number of reasons. It has huge oil reserves, It has the largest population of any African country, like I mentioned, 186 million. And 50% of those 186 million, or about 93 million people, are Muslims. 50% of Nigeria is Muslim. That's a huge fact that I think gets overlooked. It's quite surprising to me, knowing that Nigeria was a British colony. And only 40% of Nigerians are Christians, and 10% would count themselves as traditionalists. This incredible number of Muslims in such a fertile country as Nigeria seems a bit out of the ordinary to me, but you have to remember that a lot of the Muslims are still in the north of the country, still closer to the Sahara, more arid. But it is an interesting situation, and the presence, such a large Muslim presence in Nigeria, to me, is the main reason why I see West Africa in kind of a precarious state regarding the balance between Christianity and Islam. Yet, at the same time, Nigeria's Muslim population, I said it was located in the north. It's more poor, generally speaking. And it does follow the trend where African Islamic countries border or exist completely within the Sahara Desert. One negative condition going on is the continuing war between Boko Haram, the Islamic extremist radical group, and the Nigerian military. And of course, Boko Haram is based in the north. Now, while Islam dominates North Africa, Saharan Africa, and has a seemingly intractable foothold in West Africa, Christians can take comfort when they look to Central and Southern Africa. These vast regions of the continent are predominantly Christian. There are no significant Muslim populations in these areas. The island nation of Madagascar is also predominantly Christian. Why the difference here in this part of the world? For one, I imagine this region was simply further from the Islamic world, further from the Middle East, from the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Oman, a bit farther away from that sphere. And second of all, European missionaries did a fairly good job of establishing bases here during the 19th and early 20th centuries from which to spread their cultures. How does Christian Africa divide between Catholic and Protestant? Or if Protestant is not a satisfying label, let's say non-Catholic and also non-Ethiopian Orthodox, which is its own category. So the Catholic Church and Protestant churches competed vigorously with each other and strove greatly to attract the maximum number of followers in Africa. Today, many African countries with majority Christian populations break fairly evenly between Catholics and non-Catholics. For example, in tiny Benin. Here, in Benin, Catholics are 25.5% of the population and non-Catholic Christians are 23%. Fairly close. Other majority Christian countries are heavily Protestant. For example, Ghana. 71.2% of Ghanaians are Christian, as opposed to 17.6% who are Muslim. But only 13.1% of Ghanaian Christians are Catholic. Obviously, the preponderance of Catholicism or Protestantism depends to some extent on whether the European colonizer was Catholic or Protestant. And if you don't know, every single African country was colonized by European power at some point, except Ethiopia. So this mother colonizer is going to have an effect if it's Catholic or Protestant. So thus, in a former French colony like Cameroon, and there was some British influence in Cameroon, mostly a French colony, and in that country today, Catholics are 38.4% of the population, and non-Catholics are only 30.8%. But actually, that difference isn't so great, is it? They're actually fairly close. It shows that Protestant missionaries still infiltrated territory that was administered by Catholic European states, namely France, but also Portugal to a smaller extent. However, there's a more clear contrast if you look at Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is an immense country. It's a huge country, probably one of the biggest countries in the world. And in this country, Catholics make up 50% of the people, and Protestants make up only 20% of the people. Now, true, Democratic Republic of the Congo was a Belgian colony, not a French colony. But Belgium was still French-speaking, it was still Catholic, so it was a similar system, I think. And it still demonstrates that a Catholic colonizer can produce a heavily Catholic society, because there's 80 million people in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and 50% of those people are Catholics and 20% are Protestants. So that's, more than 40 million Catholics, and then, 15, 20 million, Protestants. And not many Muslims in that part of the world, because now we're getting in south, so Christians don't have to worry about Islam in that part of the world. There's not really too many Muslims there. They never established themselves there. So getting back to the question of Catholicism and Protestantism, how good was France at spreading Christianity? So after all, not even the British African Empire could compare to the amount of territory and cultures contained within the French African Empire. It really was one of the biggest land-based empires we've ever seen. Perhaps Genghis Khan's empire was bigger. But the French ability to spread Christianity seemed to be effective, but also not so effective at the same time. Or in other words, it depends on location. As we know, the Saharan countries are predominantly Muslim, even though these Saharan countries, vast majority of them became French colonies for quite some time. But Islam remained. However, you may argue that France had success spreading Christianity in at least some of its West African and Central African possessions. Another Catholic European state with a large stake in Africa was Portugal. The two largest colonies of Portugal in Africa were present-day Angola and present-day Mozambique. How Catholic are these places today? Well, 41.1% of Angola is Catholic, but 38.1% are Protestant. So there's no Catholic dominance there. It's a similar situation in Mozambique, where 28.4% are Catholic, and non-Catholic Christians compose 27.7%. So the picture of Christianity that emerges in Africa is that Catholics have a heavy foothold, but they don't really dominate any country besides Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they have 50% of the population, or about 40 million followers. But the truth I see is that most Christian majority African countries are either neck and neck between Catholics and non-Catholics, or are in fact dominated by Protestants or other varieties of non-Catholic Christianity. I already mentioned heavily Protestant Ghana. Statistics don't reveal the nature of Nigeria's roughly 74 million Christians, but due to the fact that Nigeria was a British colony, I suspect the breakdown would also favor Protestants there. South Africa, also colonized by the British after Protestant Dutch settlers had already established themselves there, is predominantly a Christian country as well, but only 7.1% of South Africa's Christians are Catholic. Zimbabwe and Zambia are heavily Protestant. These two countries may perhaps be the most Protestant African nations by their proportions of the respective population. In Zimbabwe, 75.9% of the population is Protestant and only 8.4% are Catholic, while 75.3% of Zambians are Protestant and only 20.2% are Catholic. The information didn't reveal the breakdown of another heavily Christian country, Malawi, but Wikipedia states that Protestants form half of Malawi's population, while Roman Catholics form another 1/5. It would make sense since Malawi was a British protectorate from 1899 to 1964. It also continues to illustrate the trend that not just Christians, but in particular Protestants, dominate the South African countries. I didn't discuss Namibia and Botswana, as those arid countries have very small populations, but they're still predominantly Christian, and I would imagine their scales tip slightly towards Protestants. I read that of the 80 to 90% of Namibia's population who are Christians, 50% of these are Lutherans. What's the situation for Christianity in East Africa? In the former Belgian colony of Rwanda, we aren't surprised to see that Catholics are 49.5% of the population, yet Protestants are 39.4% of the population, and another 4.5% include themselves as other Christians. So in other words, Protestants and Catholics are nearly neck and neck in Rwanda. Burundi, just south of Rwanda, and in contrast to its neighbor, does show a dominance of Catholics, where they're 62.1% of the population, as opposed to 23.9% of Burundians who are Protestant. Uganda, also a former British colony, is 45.1% Protestant and 39.3% Catholic, so it's close. But in total, this represents 32 million Christians, yet another solid block of Christians in Africa. I don't have detailed info on religions in Tanzania, which is a much bigger country with a bigger population, but it's also a former British colony, and before that a German colony, where currently 61.4% of the Tanzanian population is Christian, or about 32 million people. Yes, another 32 million in addition to those 32 million people I just mentioned in Uganda who are Christian. I suspect that the religious breakdown in Tanzania may be similar to what you see in Uganda. One thing that makes Tanzania a bit different from the nations further to the south or west of it is that 35.2% of Tanzanians are Muslims. And that represents 18 million people, which is fairly significant. This again reminds us that we are now approaching the edges of the Islamic world. Muslims have a heavy presence in East Africa, especially along the coast and the coastal islands like Unguja, or, you know, popularly known as the big island where Zanzibar town is located. That, you know, that's predominantly a Muslim place. And so this Muslim influence goes back hundreds of years, even thousands of years. The Arabs who were taking their ships in that part of the world, they had slave ports in Tanzania, maybe other slave ports too in other countries. But one of their principal slave ports was Bagamoyo on the Indian Ocean, about 75 kilometers north of Dar es Salaam. And I stayed in this town for over 4 months. However, Muslims do not dominate East Africa. They are not so neck and neck with the Christians as they are in West Africa, where you really are neck and neck. Somalia may be said to be an East African country where virtually everyone is Muslim. It's true. However, Somalia only has 10 million people. And again, why? Well, kind of a dry, arid place. Same general trend applies. So that 10 million people isn't so significant if you look at the much larger populations of Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. Like Somalia is very insignificant compared to that. Not to say it can't present a threat. I mean, we know of the certain, you know, what Al-Shabaab is a terrorist group that's threatening Kenya, and they're based from Somalia partly. Anyways, so when we move on to some other countries apart from Tanzania, and I mentioned Somalia not really being so significant, we could look at Kenya, which is another British colony, and 83% of Kenya is Christian. I find that very significant. 83%, that's quite high. It represents about 39 million Christians. Quite another solid block of Christians in Africa. And of that block, 47.7% are Protestant, and 23.4% are Catholic, and another 11.9% use the term other Christians, so non-Catholic, whatever that means. Meanwhile, Muslims represent only 11.2% of Kenya's population. I was a bit surprised. I thought it would be a bit higher, seeing as how Kenya is now closer to the Islamic world. And so that 11.2% means Kenya has about 5.2 million Muslims living there. Still significant. North of Kenya and Uganda, we have South Sudan and Ethiopia. Both of these countries are predominantly Christian, though there is practically no specific data for South Sudan. It's just a very unstable part of the world. They've been having a war and separating from the greater Sudan. And so I'm not surprised that there's no data there. But I do know that it's predominantly Christian, whereas Sudan, to the north, is predominantly Muslim. So that's no coincidence about why those two places separated. And when we look at Ethiopia, It might be the most unique country in Africa of its sizable 102 million inhabitants. Fully 43.5% count themselves as Ethiopian Orthodox. Now, Ethiopian Orthodox is a branch of Christianity tracing its descent directly to the Holy Land without the interference of any European alterations or European missionaries giving them a particular version of Christianity. So for the Ethiopian Christians, they've been Christian at least as long as anyone else. I also understand that Ethiopia has some presence of some extensions of Judaism, so it's a very interesting place culturally. Ethiopia is also the only African country never to be colonized by European power, as I already mentioned. The Italians tried to conquer Ethiopia in the 1930s, but they were defeated in battle. The British author Graham Hancock has documented the cultural reality that Ethiopian Orthodox believe they possess the Ark of the Covenant, a terrible weapon from an ancient age, supposedly containing the 10 Commandments from God that Moses received on the Mount. Some have likened the Ark to a radioactive device. 18.5% of Ethiopians are also Protestant. So you have that Protestant element there too, and that represents 19 million people. Only 0.7% are Catholics, so practically no Catholics in Ethiopia, but a whopping 33.9%, or 34 million people, are Muslims in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia does have a strong Muslim presence as well. Certainly a diverse cultural country, very unique, nothing quite like it. So again, looking at these countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, it does show us that we are again on the edges of Christendom and Islam. Now let's move back a bit to the center. Let's get back to the Central African Republic. This is split evenly between Protestants and Catholics, each with 25% of the population. And only 15% of the population of C.A.R. is Muslim. So that's, again, they're not dominant at all. It is a Christian country. Surprisingly, 35% of people in the Central African Republic ascribe to indigenous beliefs. And that's the strongest showing of indigenous proportion in any African country. However, we should keep in mind that the C.A.R. only has 5.5 million people, as I've mentioned. That's not very much. It is still interesting, however, to see that it represents yet another vacuum, besides a vacuum in the sense of being ripe for economic development, agricultural development, probably population growth. It's also ripe for religious development by either Islam or Christianity. But clearly Christianity has the upper hand already because it's already established there. Now heading back more across Africa to the West Atlantic coast, I wanted to say a quick word about the Republic of the Congo, not to be confused with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and also a quick word about Gabon, which I've mentioned already, which is right next to the Republic of the Congo. So these two countries both have tiny populations. I already told you about Gabon's measly 1.7 million inhabitants. In Republic of the Congo, there are 4.5 million, but that's still not much for a fertile area, slightly smaller than the American state of Montana. The point is that these two countries have no significant Muslim presence. Christianity is already established in these places. What countries in Africa stand out as strange or odd? Well, besides Ethiopia, I suppose I was struck by the oddness of the statistics about Chad, which is a central Saharan nation completely landlocked. Being in the Sahara, Chad is a majority Muslim nation, but I was surprised to see that Muslims are only 58.4% of the population. 18.5% is Catholic, 16.1% is Protestant. And this is according to 2009 estimates. So my question and my reaction is, how did Christian missionaries manage to penetrate such a far-off desert land that has traditionally been dominated by the Muslim world? And I don't know the answer. Now that all of the African nations have been independent from the European countries for over half a century, I mean, a lot of these countries got their independence in the 60s, like Ghana got it first in 1957, a lot of countries followed after in the early 60s. So how successful have they been advancing on their own? Do any of the European powers have they left particularly bad legacies or perhaps particularly good legacies? For example, how are former British colonies like Ghana and Nigeria doing these days compared to former French colonies like Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, and Niger? Well, I didn't look at economic statistics, to be honest, like gross domestic product, but I do have some knowledge of the economic strength of various African countries, and I put it in perspective with the information I did encounter, and especially looking at the land, how fertile it is, what's the population, how much space do they have, what resources do they have. I took it all into account, and I still think that Nigeria and Ghana stand out as economically strong compared to their neighbors who are former French colonies. I mean, Nigeria has plenty of problems of internal stability, of course, but so do many of these countries. The former French colony of Cameroon seems to have developed extensively economically in the manner that the Nigerian economy has developed. Cameroon has a population of 24 million people, which is an impressively high number, and 60% of that is Christian. It's my opinion that former French colonies have done a bit more poorly than those that were British. Now, French possessions were larger and more widespread in Africa than those of the British, and some of these countries have done better, though I couldn't give you a specific example. And we know that some former British colonies have done terribly, but overall, British colonies seem to produce more robust and successful independent nations. I'm stretching it a bit, I know. Besides Zimbabwe, you can point to the present meltdown of South Africa. It was much stronger 30 years ago. You can blame that on socialism, but still, South Africa is ahead of many African countries. You know, look at Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, like I mentioned, Nigeria, and Ghana. These were all the principal British African possessions, and they're all more economically developed than the vast majority of their formerly French neighbors. Likewise, the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique didn't seem to do too well after independence. I won't speak about the Spanish. They only colonized tiny Equatorial Guinea. And I don't need to say much about the Dutch. They only had an impact in South Africa and around that area, and then not even officially through the Dutch government, kind of like settlers taking land on their own, like the Boers, and they got into a war with the British, and they had the Boer War. And anyways, or you could, the Germans. The Germans did have a real effect in East Africa, some other places, but they were soon supplanted by the British, like the Dutch settlers were in South Africa. And none of the Islamic countries, on the other hand, are doing particularly well either. They're probably doing even worse. So I would prize, I'm obviously favoring Protestantism. I have a heavy bias towards the British Empire. I won't deny that. But I do like to rank countries in some sense. I do see the benefits of Christianity. Even if it's French or Catholic or Portuguese, that's still better than being an Islamic country. No offense if you're a Muslim. I'm just saying, on a cultural level and societal level, are these countries going to advance? I tend to favor capitalism and Christianity. So I'm overall, I was assured by the data. It didn't convince me that Islam is going to overcome Christianity, or these more free capitalist countries in Africa. Are they going to overcome? They're going to overwhelm the Christian? I don't see it happening, but I do see this neck and neck situation continuing for a while. It's going to be producing tension for at least 100 or maybe forever. It's going to go back and forth. But the most encouraging thing is that Christians seem to have central Southern Africa completely established themselves there with huge populations, most of East Africa to themselves. It's only in West Africa where they're neck and neck, and then of course there's no reason to expand into Sahara or North Africa. That's never been their territory anyways. That's not sub-Saharan Africa. That's not even the traditional homeland of black Africans. That's for the Arabs. That's for mixed peoples who live in the deserts and all that stuff. So I hope you found that information entertaining or useful. And that's all I have for you for now. Hasta luego, amigos.